My name's Charlie, and I'm here today to talk to you about parasites. Parasites have a really bad reputation. When you think of them, you think of intestinal worms, brain-eating amoeba, things that live inside you and eat you. I'm here today to tell you that that stereotype is absolutely true. I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me a little bit. This is my first ever talk, and I'm absolutely terrified. But being scared is a really interesting response that has evolved over years and years. So however much it feels unpleasant at the moment, that my heart is racing and my hands are sweaty, I understand that this has kept me safe for a lot of years. If we don't have that fear response, animals start to act really weird. So unlike me, that rat had something going on with its brain. It had lost its ability to be scared of the cat. And I suspect that comes from a parasite called toxoplasma. Toxoplasma has a very clever way of getting inside the brains of mice and changing that fear response so they no longer fear the smell of cat urine, but instead run towards it. It's not the only parasite that's very good at manipulating your brain. The large blue butterfly, very creatively named, the female lays their eggs on a plant, and the larva from the large blue butterfly has a similar way of changing the brains of those around it. It will start to release pheromones, and these pheromones are picked up by adult ants, and they then start to see it as a baby ant. It completely tricks them into bringing it inside the ant's nest. Once inside the ant's nest, it has two options. Either it behaves and acts like a baby ant and begs for food, or a much darker version, it eats all of its nestmates. Some parasites go for brute force rather than brain manipulation. This is the yellow-billed oxpecker. It's got a taste for blood. It spends most of summer picking off the ticks off the back of cattle in the savannah, but when the ticks run out, it takes to opening up holes in the side of the cattle. The noise they make when they're doing this is absolutely terrifying, which you might hear. Another parasite that goes for the tactic of brute force is the cookie cutter shark. There's not much we know about this shark. We know that its fins are quite small, which is unusual for an animal that lives out in open water, and we know that it feasts at night. These sharks only grow about 1/2 meter, but their prey tends to be orca whales and great white sharks. The way the cookie cutter shark does this is by using a system of cells on its back that glow. And so the great white shark thinks, a tiny snack, makes its way towards the tiny snack, and the tiny snack turns on it, using some of the sharpest teeth in the animal kingdom to tear a hole in its flesh. They do this by using sort of like a vacuum suction mouth, which they then twist and pull and remove chunks from the flesh of these great ocean predators. You can see in this that these wounds don't usually kill their prey, but enough that it causes serious long-term problems, and if they're unlucky enough to get an infection, then it can kill them. So what does the large blue butterfly, a cookie cutter shark, and the other example have in common? They're all parasites, and the definition of parasite is any animal that lives more or less exclusively off of another creature. I'm going to do a really brief Parasitology 101. The rest of my talk will be focused on internal parasites. They're sort of the ones that you're thinking of when you think of parasites. First up, we have flukes. Flukes are small, leaf-shaped, they don't grow very big, and they like to live in your organs. They're particularly after your liver, or your blood, or your heart, or anywhere that they can settle down and make a home. Roundworm does as it says on the tin. It's a worm, and it's round. These are a big problem to humans. About 25% of the population have roundworm. if you've come here today with 3 other people, chances are it's one of you. Tapeworm. Tapeworm are giant. A tapeworm can grow up to 3 or 4 meters. There's been some horrendous cases of these ending up in people's toilets. And the last category are amoeba and protozoa. I've lumped them together for the sake of this because they act in a very similar way. They're microscopic, which means we can't see them, but they do tend to be the most killer. Out of all of these, I do not want an amoeba. So a parasite has a few aims in its life, and they're quite similar to ours. Firstly, they have to invade. So they have to find a way to cross the skin, they have to find a way to get in the brain, they have to find a way to get into another host. Then they have to migrate, whether this means they want to get into your brain for the food, or they want to move through your intestines, or if they want to move from you to another species. And once they've migrated, they need to eat. This is sometimes your poo, sometimes your blood, sometimes your lymphatic fluid. And then, like all animals, it's time to reproduce. They have to find a mate, which can be incredibly hard if you're in the darkness of another host's intestines, and you have to make babies. And then you have to do the whole thing all over again. So although parasites have to master all of these, there are a few species that really stand out as particularly good. So I'm going to speak first about invasion. So this parasite might not look familiar, but this is Plasmodium. It is responsible for almost 1 million deaths a year. It causes the disease malaria. It's got a few clever tactics for invasion. It uses another creature, actually another parasite, as a vehicle to get into you. The way Plasmodium works is it gets sucked up by the mosquito, bites another host, and accidentally sicks up some blood, and in the process infects you as well. Once inside, the invasion of Plasmodium hasn't ended. The next thing it needs to do is get into cells. A Plasmodium is quite useless in one cell. It needs to work its way around your whole body. It does this by brute force. You can see here as the Plasmodium replicates within one cell, leaves the cell, and then forces into another, and then replicates in the next cell. You can also see these are red blood cells. You can also see how that doesn't feel pleasant at all for the person suffering with it. So next up for invasion, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Anything named brain-eating is not good. It's a single cell with these two, you can sort of just see at the back these 2 tails. And the reason for these tails is because they love to live in warm, fresh water. So if you've ever been to America and you've seen a beautiful warm lake and you've gone swimming with your friends, that's where this guy likes to live. Now the way the brain-eating amoeba gets into your brain is really smart. What it relies on is you doing some splashing around, getting the amoeba up your nose, and it will latch onto the nerves at the back of your nose and start crawling up the nerve into a tunnel and to cross over into your brain. So why the brain? The brain is a fantastic home. It's warm, it's got lots of nutrients, and it's got a never-ending supply of food. The brain-eating amoeba has these 3 suckers that give it the ability to eat your brain tissue. Using these 3 suckers, it finds a neuron, it sucks onto them, it releases enzymes that break down the neuron, and within seconds, it's being pulled apart. It's probably not surprising that this is an almost 100% fatality rate. Very few people to contract this have survived. You can see the sort of brain damage that this leaves. If you look at the front, this massive chunk that's been taken away, that would have only been about a week's worth of damage. So that's it for invasion. We're going to move on to migration. Parasites have two things they want to migrate to. Either they want to migrate around the same host, or they want to migrate into a different host to complete their life cycle. A lot of parasites can't sexually reproduce in the first species they infect. So the first one I'm going to speak about is Echinococcus. Echinococcus is not something we have to worry about in this country. Unless you're a red fox, then it can be a problem. But it's a massive concern in the Middle East. Echinococcus migrates around the host's body. It causes disease. Sorry, this is really gross, and I should have given a heads up. It causes disease by creating these cysts. And they create these cysts out of the host's own tissue. So it takes some of these tissues, it takes bits of these cells, it modifies them, and it creates itself a really nice, cozy home. Unfortunately, that cozy home can be the lungs. You can see in this X-ray the sort of cysts you get if your body ends up filtering out the migrating Echinococcus. And I'm not a fantastic expert with brain scans, but you can see that this is just one individual parasite's home that it's built in the brain. And again, depending on where in the brain it's ended up, depends on what your symptoms are. It's got a really high fatality rate. So, next up. This particular parasite is called a brood sac. The green one is the green-banded brood sac. This is it's actually a sack of eggs that essentially work together. So snail's going around its business, eats some eggs, and these eggs get together and they move as one organism and push their way into the eye stalks of the snail. Once there, they start changing the behavior of the snail. What they want to do is get from this snail into a bird. And the way it's going to do that is by mimicking a really tasty maggot. So this is a process that's evolved over many, many years, and it works really well. In addition to this disco eyes going on, the parasite also forces it to climb out into the sunlight and get as high up as possible so that a bird can find it really easily, swoop down, and grab it. Another one for behavioral changes for migration. The parasite that infects this ant also wants to get into a bird, but is going to go for a different tactic. This is a gliding ant. It's a tropical species of ant. And it's prone to a parasite that does this to its body. This is one of the first cases known as fruit mimicry. So what this parasite is trying to do is make the ant's body look like a fruit for the sake of the bird coming down to get it. Again, it changes its behavior. It forces the ant to climb upwards and expose itself and lift it. It changes the color and shape of its abdomen and forces it to lift up, making it really easy for a bird to swoop down and pluck it. When the bird does eat it, it's accidentally ingested hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these parasitic eggs, which then hatch inside their body, and if everything goes well for the parasite, will be excreted by an ant's nest, and the whole process will be repeated again when the adult ants feed their babies bird feces. It's really grim. Probably not as grim as this one. This is probably the most extreme version of brain-controlling parasite that we see in the animal kingdom. This is the horsehair worm. Now, the horsehair worm will go for almost any sort of hopping-looking insect. And the first thing it does is it starts to grow, gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it decides it wants to continue its life cycle. Now, the only way for it to do that is to get its eggs into the water again, so that someone else can drink it, another insect can drink it, and it can continue the cycle. So it does that by hijacking the brain of whatever insect it's managed to infect and forcing it to seek out a body of water and makes it jump in and kill itself for the purpose of the worm then exploding out of it. Again, a really grim video. So at this point, the parasite doesn't care about keeping the cricket alive. There's no reason to. So if you thought it was grim, it's going to get worse. Another thing a parasite needs to do is to feast. This is the scolex of a tapeworm. A tapeworm is essentially just a head and reproductive organs all the way down. The actual body is just this bit. Now, the scolex is designed to hook onto the intestines, and although it looks like a mouth, that's not what this does. What this does is roots itself really firmly into your intestines, so it doesn't matter how strong your bowel movements are, it's going to stay there. And it does this using a series of suckers, which are these round bits at the front, and hooks. Every tapeworm is different. Every tapeworm is beautiful. They come in all different shapes and sizes. You can sort of see this one on the bottom right. That relies more on suckers, same as the top left. The one on the bottom left, scientists still haven't figured out how that roots into the intestines, but we expect it's a case of everything grabs a bit. Another one for feasting is ticks. Depending on what species of tick you're talking about, it will only ever feed 4 times, maybe 5. Ticks feed as a way to give them energy to grow. So you start off with this tiny, tiny flea, and it will climb up to the top of a blade of grass. It will hold its arms out in the guard position, and it will wait for an animal to come past. It will grab on, sink its teeth in, which is basically sticking its entire head into the animal, drink, get really big, drop off, and in a food coma on the floor of the forest, it will then shed that skin, grow a new one, and repeat the process again after a few months when it's recovered from its blood meal. With ticks, they can only grow with that blood meal, so they'll only grow after each meal until they get massive. This is what tick's mouth parts look like. You can sort of count the hooks on it. If anyone's ever had a tick on their dog's, cat's legs, you'll know they're incredibly hard to pull off. And the reason for this, these series of hooks, that means you can't just yank it out. It's a clever way for the tick to make sure it is well and truly embedded in your leg. As you can see, sorry, I can see people looking really grossed out by that. That's the one that grossed you out, not the grasshopper. So the trick with ticks, if you've got to remove a tick, do not squeeze it. It will just vomit all the blood back into you. You don't want that. Lyme disease is on the rise in the UK. You want to essentially get tweezers and flick it off. Pull it up and flick it off. Don't squeeze it. Okay, another one. Sorry. This is a type of louse. So I've sort of moved off of the intestinal worms just for a little bit. This is a louse. This louse will seek out a fish. It's a really clever way to live this. It will seek out a fish, it will eat its tongue, and it will replace its tongue, and it will sit there for the rest of its life, happily munching on whatever it can get its teeth on. When you're living in another animal, it makes your life a lot easier. There's no worries about having to work out where your next meal is coming from. This is another angle of the same thing. It sits really far back. There are no studies on how comfortable this is for the fish, but I expect it's unpleasant. Okay, so the next thing is reproduce. With reproduction in parasites, you can face quite a few problems. One of those problems is trying to find a mate. These guys have got it cracked. So the larger of this is schistosoma. Schistosoma are a type of roundworm. In this species and in many species across ecosystems generally, it is the skinny one that's the female. No. Skinny one that's the male, it's the big one that's the female. Because the chances of bumping into another intestinal worm if you're living in the intestines of another creature are really slim, These guys have got a tactic. Once they find each other, the female wraps the male up in her, and they live monogamously for the rest of their lives, wrapped up like this. I actually think it's quite romantic, sort of. You can get a bit of a better idea how this looks. So this sort of way of reproducing works for a number of reasons. They can protect each other, particularly for the little male who might be a little bit lost in the world on his own. And there's no reason for them to have to worry about finding another mate every few weeks or every few days. Together like this, entwined as a monogamous pair, they can produce up to 300 eggs a day. Works really well. Another way of reproducing is if you can make babies with yourself, which is the method that tapeworms go for. As I mentioned a bit earlier, tapeworms are essentially just a head and reproductive organs. Tapeworms are hermaphroditic. This means that in each of those segments are the reproductive parts of a male and a female. So they don't actually need to find another partner at all. They can attach to the intestines and live happily ever after alone. When the male and female reproductive parts of each segment are ready to make eggs, they mature, and it works like a conveyor belt, essentially. So when they're mature, when they're ready to go out into the world, these little sacs can contain up to 200,000 eggs, and they drop off the end of the adult worm and head out into the world. The way the tapeworm eats, which I should have mentioned with the feasting part, is they absorb nutrients through their skin. This is why they don't need a mouth, and they can use their mouth to grip onto the intestines instead. Evade. So the immune system's really good for the majority of animals. Parasites have to find ways that they can evade the immune system. When I talk about the immune system, you probably remember from school, white blood cells, all sorts of alarm signals being released when there is an infection. They've got to find ways around this. Plasmodium has a smart way of doing this. So Plasmodium will infect your red blood cells, hopefully not yours personally. They'll infect the red blood cells, kill them, rip out the insides, and then wear the skin of their dead enemy as a disguise. So this means that there is no way your body can tell that you have malaria, because all of those cells just look like normal cells. I don't know if anyone's seen Firefly, the way reavers work and dress up in their dead enemies. It's basically the same principle. So we can't get a photograph of what this looks like because it's too tiny and it would involve killing too much. But this is sort of what it would look like if you had a CGI image of this. Another tactic. This is trichinella. You catch it from not cooking your food properly or not washing your hands properly or a mixture of both. It's a really, really tiny roundworm. I saw a lot. Living in Iceland, polar bears particularly are really prone to this, and it circles between polar bears and seals and Arctic creatures. And what trichinella does is it makes home inside your muscles. In your muscles, you don't have those white blood cells, you don't have those alarm signals, you don't have those signs that can pick up what's going on. So trichinella just curls up in your muscles and it stays there. And you catch it by eating uncooked or poorly cooked meat that has got this in it. Actually, part of the reason I don't eat meat, when you're a parasitologist, it becomes really difficult not to notice when these eggs are in your food. Sorry. I can't remember which subject I'm on at the moment. Oh, evading the immune system. Another way you can evade the immune system is hiding in the eyeball. I really recommend, if you've got a weak stomach, not to watch this video. But this is an example of a parasite that uses the eyeball as somewhere to hide from your immune system. Pretty grim. So the way that this parasite does this is it's eaten as an egg, it cuts a hole in the back of the eye, it wriggles through, and it makes itself home. And it's a good home at that. There's no way that the frog can remove that. It's not an ectoparasite. It can't get someone to bite it off of it. It can't do anything to that parasite without damaging its own eye. So it's basically stuck there until it reproduces, and then there's more stuck there. Okay, it's not all bleak. We do have ways that we can fight back. One of the ways we can do this is calcification. And the way calcification works is all the calcium that you've been ingesting into your body, we can actually use, obviously without knowing it, to create stones. And by creating these stones, it stops the parasite from spreading, getting infected, or moving anywhere else in the body. It's a little bit like the same tactic we have as dumping cement on a fire, no, not a fire, on a nuclear reactor. If something goes wrong, it keeps everything really contained. So this is echinococcus that I was talking about earlier in the brain, and it's completely calcified. This was found incidentally, and incredibly didn't actually have any impact on the patient's life. This is echinococcus again, this time up higher up in the lung, and it's also been calcified in the same way. This is a worm. You can sort of, I think I've got a pointer. Do I have a pointer? Oh, you can't see it on the X-ray though. So you can just about see the shape of these worms on these X-rays, and that's calcification as well. So I mentioned earlier about our immune system and how it will respond. This is a species of worm that can live basically anywhere in your body, but in this instance happens to be in the blood. What you see here is the response of the white blood cells when they notice something's gone wrong. From here, the white blood cells will completely demolish the parasitic worm. It's a shame that we can't have that reaction to all of our parasites. So how about the future? The future of parasites holds, there's two key issues when we look into the future of parasites. One of these is that we're making parasites into medicine. You might have already heard of the hygiene theory. Hygiene theory says that as the West is getting more and more sterile, as we're getting more and more clean, that we're accidentally causing an increase in asthma and other diseases because we no longer have the parasites in us that we needed to keep that immune system suppressed a little bit. The other thing going into the future is the eradication of diseases. I'm going to talk about both of these in a little bit more detail. Firstly, using parasites as medicine. It sounds really gross, and within the next few years, it's probably going to advance a bit more than going to your doctor and drinking some parasite eggs. But the way this works is, in theory, you would go to the doctor, you would have some parasitic worm eggs. They would come from a pig. And the reason that they would come from a pig is because the pig worms are very, very similar to ours. We're basically identical to pigs in terms of our biology. But it means that they can't complete their life cycle in us. So you can't end up with an out-of-control infection that goes on forever and ever of breeding worms inside your intestines. The way it would work in theory is that people that suffer with diseases like Crohn's disease, MS, asthma, these things are known as autoimmune, which means your immune system is fighting itself. Now, a way that this could work is introducing these worms into our body would help almost distract the immune system for a bit to relieve symptoms of the disease. I don't know why that picture's there. Probably to illustrate what it would look like if you had medicine from, if you had worms as medicine. So talking a bit about the eradication of disease, this is a 14th century painting of a French saint, and it's believed to be one of the first visual depictions of a parasite known as dracunculiasis, or guinea worm. Thankfully, guinea worm is now almost extinct. It has been one of the most successful cases of parasite eradication. In 1985, we had 3.5 million cases of this, and in 2015, we only had 22. Guinea worm is a particularly nasty worm. The way it works is you would unknowingly take a glass of water with a water flea in it. This water flea contains an egg. After that, you don't know you've done it, you won't feel any symptoms for an entire year until you notice a small boil, usually on your leg. And you keep looking at this boil and trying to work out what this boil is. And one day you just see like this tiny, tiny pinpoint of something sticking out of it. That's the end of the guinea worm, and the reason it's stuck its bum out of this boil is for the purpose of laying eggs. Unfortunately, by the time that boil has turned up, the guinea worm is already over 1 meter long, and it has wrapped its way through your blood vessels. The only way to remove this is by using a stick, and you grab the end of its tail, you use a stick, and you gently twist it over the course of months, and the guinea worm is pulled out. It's absolutely horrible. It has impacted in the past many, many people's lives. It's prevented children from going to school. It's meant people have had to take time off work because not only is it painful, but it makes you want to puke because it's really gross. There's a reason I didn't include an actual photo of it. So, guinea worm is just one of the 10 infectious diseases that the London Declaration of January 2013 sought to eradicate by 2020. We're running out of time in terms of getting to 2020, but we've done a really, really significant job of this. You can see on this map the places the highest concentration of this type of, they call it neglected tropical diseases. They're the tropical diseases that not much money goes into funding. And about 8 years ago, I was in one of those countries. I was in West Africa, Ghana, and it was really common for me to see these sort of parasites. It's probably what ended up shaping my career, was seeing how gross and horrible guinea worm is. But now they're all on their way down. The London Declaration saw massive amounts of pharmaceutical companies coming together and offering medication for these diseases for free, and they said they will not stop until every single one of them is eradicated or controlled to a point that we can manage them. Parasites we've been talking about today as entertainment. We see these and we think, isn't that gross, isn't that cool, isn't that fun? But for a lot of people, for most people, we forget that we're a minority here. For the majority of people, these are something they have to deal with absolutely every day of their life. It's estimated that over 1 million deaths a year are caused by parasites, some that I mentioned today. You'll see on this list cystic echinococcus, which was the one with causing all those boils in the lungs. What else did I mention? Obviously malaria being one of the most well-known. We're lucky that we get to leave this lecture today and we've got clean water coming out of taps. We've got toilets that takes our poo away so we don't have to think about it. But we have to remember we are a minority. This is not true for most of the world. If anything I've said today has inspired you at all to get involved with the END Fund, they are part of this eradication attempt. Parasites are absolutely beautiful, but they are terrifying. Join us on the fight against them. Thank you.